delighted to welcome you back as we are continuing our studies of New Testament Greek. We're coming this time to chapter 10 of Machen's text, so if you've been following along and doing the work of a good student, then you should be ready to plow into this chapter. This chapter does introduce a new idea. If you've been paying attention, you've noticed that so far most of our focus has been on the part of the Greek language that has to do with nouns. So we've been dealing with nouns themselves, pronouns, adjectives. All of those are more or less related to the use of nouns in a language. With this chapter 10, we're now shifting our focus and we'll start looking at verbs, and you'll find that verbs are going to preoccupy our interest now for some time to come. When we get to chapter 18, we'll kind of put it together with what are called verbal nouns, participles, but we'll save that for a little bit of a later discussion. But right now we want to pick up the side of the language that really has to do with verbs. You may recall when we first introduced verbs back in chapter 3, we said that verbs have tense, voice, and mood. And really so far all we've noted and all we've had to deal with in the Greek language is the present tense, the active voice, and the indicative mood. And we're not going to expand our horizons too much at this point, but nevertheless we need to start understanding that there are some other tenses and moods and voices that we can use. So in this chapter we're going to be staying with the present tense, we're going to be staying with the indicative mood, but we are going to look at a different voice. You know that languages usually have an active voice and a passive voice. An active voice is when the subject of the sentence is actually doing something. I throw the ball, you see, then that would be the active voice. However, if we're talking about the passive voice, then the action is being done to the subject of the sentence. I am being thrown by the ball. That doesn't make much sense, of course, but you get the idea. When the subject of the sentence has the action being done to it, then that shifts to the passive voice. The same thing is true in Greek. So we have the active voice and the passive voice, but unlike many languages, Greek also introduces a voice in the middle, and it's called the middle voice. We don't do a lot with the middle voice as such in our studies of Greek, but we do need to be aware of it. The basic function of the middle voice in Greek had to do with a kind of reflexive action. If I do something that has to do with myself, I wash myself, I clothe myself, that kind of thing, would ordinarily use the middle voice in Greek. There are some middle voice applications in the Greek New Testament, but the more important reason that we're going to be concerned about the middle voice is because the verbs that are used in the New Testament often make use of the endings associated with the middle voice, even if the actual sense of the middle is not present. So how do you know that you're working with the middle voice? Well, Greek verbs have a separate set of endings that go with the middle voice. So for example, so far you've learned the endings that go with the active voice. We took the verb blepo, it's blepo, blepes, blepe, and in the plural side, blepomen, blepeta, blepusi. And so you've got those mastered now, you feel real comfortable with that. How do we know we have the middle voice or the passive voice? Well, it's because the ending changes. So we're going to see now the endings become blepomai, blepe, blepetai, blepometha, blepestha, blepontai. And so when you run into those, you're going to know immediately that you're dealing with something besides the active voice. You'll be happy to know that the middle and passive endings are identical when you're in the present indicative, and so we're only going to learn one new set of endings. It won't be so nice in the future. We're going to learn a lot of different endings that'll go with various ways in which the Greek verb can be conjugated, but right now we're going to keep it fairly simple, as does Machen, and just learn one new set of endings. And I would just recommend that you learn to tick those off. Blepomai, blepe, blepetai, blepometha, blepestha, blepontai. You know, just be able to tick those off quickly. And then as you're working through exercises and so on, you're going to find that that makes your task somewhat easier. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but just be aware that that is basically the most important emphasis that we're going to be dealing with in this chapter. The use of the passive voice gives rise to the need for some other grammatical tools, And largely that has to do with the use of the word by. You know that in English, if I'm going to use the passive voice, I just gave you an example a moment ago, I am thrown, and then naturally we want to have some preposition that gives a sense to me being thrown. I am being thrown by the ball, you know, that nonsensical sentence I use. Well, notice how the word by is necessary to give some kind of sense to the notion of being thrown, that passive sense. And so we need some way to do that in Greek. There's two ways that are the most common. One is the use of the preposition hupo. And so we're going to be introduced to that particular preposition in this chapter, hupo, which with the genitive means by and is very frequently used in connection with the passive voice. And so we're going to be introducing that, and you'll see it as we go along. There is, however, another way of achieving the same end, and that is by what Machen calls the dative of means. Now, I just want to give you a heads up. This is a perfectly legitimate way to describe it, the dative of means. The reason it's called that is because it is the dative case and has the same spelling as the dative case, but it's a somewhat different meaning associated with the dative. So if you have a word in the dative case, it can also be translated using the word by. We introduce that in the English translation in order to make sense out of the Greek, but the Greek isn't using the word by, it's actually using a peculiar application of the dative. Some Greek grammarians actually distinguish the dative from a separate case that they call the instrumental case. And the instrumental case would probably be a little bit better of a description of this, but Machen wants to not confuse us too much, and so he's going to keep using the word dative, but distinguish a slightly different use of the word dative by of the application of the dative case by calling it the dative of means. So, for example, in the exercises, you're going to see certain things happening by the word of the Lord. It'll be to logo to theou, you see, by the word of God. Well, notice to logo is in the dative, and that would be the dative of means. By the word of God, we are being saved, or some such thing. The distinction between the dative of means and the use of hupo is typically, but not always, a distinction between a personal actor and an impersonal one. So if I were to say by the word of the Lord, that is the word Lord, the word word there actually is impersonal, and typically you would use the dative of means. Whereas if I'm saying that something happens by God or by God's power, then God is the agent, and in that case I would probably use hupo. So you'll notice that. If you can just remember, dative of means tends to refer to impersonal actors, and the hupo with the genitive refers to personal actors. You'll find that tends to hold to hold as we go through. A couple of other little details here to be aware of. One is what's called the deponent verbs. If you've studied Latin and certain other languages, you know there is such a thing as a deponent verb. The basic meaning of deponent is that the verb has an active meaning, but uses, in the case of Greek, a middle or passive ending. For example, we're going to have the verb erchomai in this particular vocabulary list. Erchomai means I go, but you'll notice the ending is middle and passive. Erchomai. It doesn't say ercho, which would be the active ending, but erchomai, a passive or middle ending, but it's still an active meaning. I go. This is often the case with intransitive verbs, verbs that don't deliver some kind of action to a direct object. Then you'll find that many times, not always, but often they will be deponent as well. So we'll take a look at those as we go along. Deponent, that's the word to understand. We also run into compound verbs. This is simply where a preposition is joined, linked to a verb. I just mentioned the verb erchomai. We're also going to have exerchomai. That's a combination of ek, the preposition that means out of, and erchomai, I go. And so the literal meaning would be I go out of, exerchomai. It would be translated I exit or something like that. You see, eis erchomai, just the opposite, I enter. Pretty easy to figure out for the most part. You can tell just by looking what the sense of the compound between the preposition and the verb is going to amount to. We also run into in this chapter the use of the word ou and ook and uch. And those three all mean the same thing. They're simply used depending on what the following word starts with, the letter it starts with, but it always means not. It is a negation. It always goes immediately before the verb that it's negating. If I say erchomai, I go, that's one thing. If I want to say I do not go, then I would say uk erchomai. I use the kappa there, uk erchomai, because erchomai starts with a noun, or I'm sorry, with a vowel. And so that makes it easier to pronounce. Uk erchomai, I do not go. The only other thing to notice in this chapter is that there are certain verbs that are apparently transitive, but they do not necessarily use the accusative. That would be typically the case that would be used for direct object. For example, we're going to find in this chapter, akuo, I hear. Akuo can take the accusative, I hear the man, akuo ton anthropon, but I might also put the word man in the genitive, and that would be perfectly acceptable. I hear tu anthropou, I hear the man. For our purposes right now, we're going to assume that the meaning is actually identical. There may be a subtle difference in the sense of it, but we don't need to worry about that right at the moment. All right, does that make sense? If so, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the details of this chapter, and then we'll work through some exercises. Well, the first thing we want to do is just take a look at the vocabulary list, as we commonly do. And so if you notice this vocabulary list, the first word that we have here is the word Allah. Allah. We've already had the word de, which means but it's kind of a soft conjunction, and it means something between but and depending on the sense of the sentence, you may translate it either way. However, the word Allah always means but, and it means but in a strong sense. If I say, I go, but you come, then that would be a sense in which we really have two opposite ideas, and that typically is where the word Allah is used, when there's a strong conjunction, a strong contrast between the preceding word, or the preceding idea, and the subsequent idea. So be aware of that. Notice that it ends with Allah, but you'll also find that if the following word starts with a vowel, that this will be contracted. So we'll have an apostrophe there, and we won't have the final syllable. So it just depends on the sentence. You'll see that in the exercises. Akuo is the verb that means I hear. You, of course, immediately recognize that the English word acoustics is taken directly from this word, akuo, so it should be easy to remember. Akuo, I hear. Hamartolos, accent on the ultima, means center. We've already had hamartia, and you'll notice immediately the similarity between these two words. Hamartia is sin, hamartolos is the perpetrator of the crime, the sinner. It's a masculine noun, and ordinarily it is masculine. I suppose if you had a feminine sinner, you might find the feminine used. So hamartolos, sinner, and of course commonly used in the New Testament. Apokrinomai is one of these compound verbs that I was mentioning. You notice that we have the apo, which is the Greek preposition from, and krino, which we're going to see a little later, means I judge. And so, in fact, we already had that, didn't we? I think last vocabulary we had krino, I judge. This is now a deponent verb. Notice it has the middle or passive ending, apokrinomai. If I'd simply said krinomai, it would be I am judged. The apo added to it doesn't give any immediately, intuitively understandable sense, but idiomatically it means I answer. And so I don't have any good way to help you remember that, except that apokrinomai, this compound verb, has to do with the notion of answering. I answer. It's an active verb, I answer, but it has the middle or passive ending. I mentioned to you a moment ago, it'll take the dative case. So if I say, I answer the man, I would say, apokrinomai, to anthropo. I answer the man. To anthropo is in the dative, so you just have to make a note of that. Archo is I rule. In the middle voice, archomai, it means I begin. So this is one case where you have a true middle used with a verb. You know the word archo, for example, archangel or archangel, maybe you pronounce it, and other words that suggest the notion of rule. A monarch is one ruler, and so we have that idea in English as well, so that should be pretty easy to remember. Archomai is the middle voice, and it means I begin. There is a sense in which something that begins an enterprise is the ruler of it, and so there is a connection there between the two, but nevertheless, two different meanings there. Genomai means I become, genomai. Notice that it takes the predicate nominative, so if I say I become a man, I'm going to say genomai ho anthropos. Notice that ho anthropos is in the nominative, because genomai is a verb that doesn't take the accusative or some other case. It takes what's called the predicate nominative. The same would be true of the word eimi, I am a man, eimi ho anthropos, I am the man. You see, it's in the nominative case. So certain verbs take the nominative. These would be the most common. Eimi, the verb we've already had, and genomai, to become. So we'll be seeing that. Notice also its deponent. So it has the middle or passive ending there, genomai, but an active meaning, I become. I'm going to drop down to this verb here, erchomai. I mentioned it before. It's a deponent verb. It means I go. And then we have these compound, eis erchomai and ex erchomai. This means I go in, I go out, de erchomai, I go through. So in each case we have a compound, and notice how the sense of the verb is modified by the meaning of the preposition. Dia means through, de erchomai, I go through. Eis means into, eis erchomai means I go into. Ex means out of, ex erchomai means I go out of. All of these based on the root verb, erchomai, deponent, I go. It can also mean I come. So that may seem odd to you, but actually the verb can have either meaning in the New Testament, as we're going to see as we go along. All right, the rest of our vocabulary words here. Hoti, rough breather. Notice that means that or because. Two different ideas, both based on this same word. I say that I am going to the store. The Greek word there would be hoti. I say that. Kind of a conjunction. The other is because. I say this because I'm going to the store. Again, the word hoti would be used in that case, and so either one of those meanings, and the only way you can tell for sure which meaning is being used is simply by the context. U, I mentioned earlier, means not. It goes immediately before the verb that it's negating. Uk, if it precedes a word that begins with a vowel, uch here, the chi, if it precedes a word that begins with a rough breather on a vowel. But no difference in meaning here, and the word u is simply the negation. Paruomai is a deponent verb. It also means I go. The difference between paruomai and erchomai is that paruomai only means I go. Erchomai is a little bit more ambiguous. I come or I go, I move is the sense of it there. But paruomai, only to go. I don't know any English cognates for that, so you'll just have to learn that one. Sozo means I save. It's related to other Greek words. You may know the word soter, savior. Soteriology is a branch of Christian theology that has to do with the doctrine of salvation. All of these are rooted in this particular verb that means I save. And then hupo, I was mentioning to you earlier. It's a preposition typically used in connection with the passive voice in Greek, and so it becomes the instrumentality by which something is taking place, and typically hupo is going to be used with a personal agent of some kind as opposed to the dative of means, which is more commonly used with an impersonal agent. Just a word now on these new endings that we're going to be looking at in this chapter. I mentioned them earlier, and you see them, of course, in the text, but just to comment on them. We have luomai, lue, luetai, luometha, luestha, luontai. As I say, you should just learn those. The best thing I can recommend to you is just learn them, tick them off in your head. Luomai, lue, luatai, luomatha, luestha, luontai. Learn to just say that, just as I'm sure you already have with the active endings, luo, lues, lue, luomin, luata, luusi. Those should just kind of roll off your tongue, without any great effort, and that will help you as you go along. And let me tell you, just a little word to the wise here, it'll be very helpful if you do this, because you're going to continue adding more and more endings. And for students that don't really master these as they're going along, it can become a somewhat challenging task later to try to keep them all straight. So my strong encouragement to you is that you really master these endings as you encounter them in each successive chapter. And that'll make adding new endings as you go along a much more pleasant process, and there'll be a little bit less of a confusion factor for you as you do so. Dropping down to paragraph 113, just to make a little note, which is a good thing to keep in mind, and Machen tries to emphasize it here, that when we're dealing with the passive indicative, you'll notice that he translates it using the verb being. So I am being loosed, you are being loosed, and so on. He notes down here in this paragraph 113 that you could actually translate this one of two different ways. You could say, I am loosed, which would be a legitimate passive sense, or you could also translate it, I am being loosed. Both are correct. However, he suggests that if you're going to be translating, at least in the early stages of your experience with Greek, you should use the verb of being here. I am being loosed, because that clarifies it. The phrase I am loosed could be describing simply a present state, you see, as opposed to a passive verb. I am loosed. I am in a loosed condition. He's actually pointing that out right here. In some cases, it's more important than in others. For example, the Greek word sozomai, I am being saved, which you have right here. Well, we could just translate it, I am saved, but I think you understand that that could suggest a little bit of a different, subtle sense of it. It's not the I am being saved as a present, progressive, ongoing circumstance, but I'm in a saved condition. The point is that when you're seeing this passive form of the verb, then it's very important to translate it with some degree of precision, and it does seem to help the precision somewhat if you go ahead and use that verb of being there. So I'm going to suggest you do that, and in fact, as I do the exercises, you'll find that I'll be using that as well, just to help you stay clear on that point. On the next page, at paragraph 114, he discusses the point that I was making earlier about the use of hupo. So you notice he says the preposition hupo with the genitive expresses the agent by which an action is performed. It is the usage commonly associated with the passive voice. So the example here, ho apostolos lue ton doulon, the apostle looses the slave, could be expressed in the passive voice as follows, ho doulos, the slave, luatai, is being loosed, and then we have this use of the word hupo. Hupo, by, takes the genitive to apostolo. So the slave is being loosed by the apostle, and that would be the typical use of hupo associated with the passive voice. Down here we have what he calls the dative of means. This is the use of the dative case to accomplish something of the same thing. So for example, if we read here at example 1, ageirontai, they are being raised up, to logo. You see the dative case there? To logo. We translate that by the word, and then to Kyriou, of the Lord. They are being raised up by means of the word of the Lord. You should also notice down here at the second example, the use of the dative of means, which doesn't necessarily involve now the passive voice of the verb. Notice what we have. Agomen, we lead, tous doulos, the slaves. Meta, with the genitive, with the sons, auton, of them. And then notice what we have here.
we have the dative plural of logos. And the dative here would normally, we would think, mean the indirect object to the words, the good words, the rest of that. But of course, in this case, we recognize this must also be the dative of means. So we lead the slaves with their sons by means of the good words. And so always keep your eyes open for that. The use of the dative can be the simple direct object, but it often is also a verb use that has to do with means, such as we find right here. And it may or may not take place along with the passive use of the verb, so you have to be aware of that on either kind of situation. Here at paragraph 116, he discusses deponent verbs. I've already mentioned this to you. Many verbs, he says, have no active forms, but only middle or passive forms, but with an active meaning, and those verbs are called deponent. This is not unique to the Greek language. Latin has deponent verbs, and I suppose other languages do as well. But the point is, deponent simply means passive in form, but active in meaning. So, for example, paruomai is passive in form, such as luomai, but paruomai is active in its meaning. So if I were to say I go, you see that's an active verb, and yet it has a passive form. So it's not too tough, just want to keep your eye open for that as you're doing the exercises, and certainly deponent verbs are quite common in the New Testament. He also mentions here compound verbs. I think I've mentioned that adequately. We looked at it in the vocabulary list. We have, for example, a verb like ek paruomai, I go out. It's paruomai with the ek affixed to the front. On the other hand, apokrinomai, which is also compound, means I answer, but as he notices here, it's not easily derived from the meaning of the component parts in that case. So that's one of those situations where the compound verb actually adds up to a word with a somewhat distinct meaning. He talks about the position of u going immediately before the word that it negates. I think that's pretty straightforward and typical of many other languages as well, so just expect that and bank on it as you're doing the exercises. And finally, notice here at paragraph 119 that he talks about the fact that some verbs take other cases than the direct object. We again have discussed this to some degree. We have, for example, akuo, tes, phones. We might normally have expected this to be tain, phonein, the accusative case, but notice here that it's taking the genitive case. He also makes a point that it can also take the accusative. There may be a subtle distinction in the meaning between the genitive and the accusative, but for purposes of right now, don't worry about that. But simply make note that sometimes akuo takes the genitive, sometimes it takes the accusative, and be looking for either one of those as you're doing the exercises. The other example we've had in this vocabulary list is apokrinomai, I answer, takes the dative, you see, so apokrinomai, I answer the apostle, not I answer to the apostle, but simply I answer the apostle. All right, well, hopefully that's sufficient discussion of the chapter. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of these exercises.
Let's turn our attention now to the first of the exercises. These are the translations from Greek to English. So I'm looking at the text here in Greek, and I notice it says luontai, hutoi, hoi, douloi, hupo, tu, kuriou. So this is now a exercise which is making use of some of my newly developed skills. I notice, first of all, I have luontai. I recognize lu. I've already had that from luo, and so I know it means I loose. Now I think to myself, ontai, I kind of recognize that. Let me go through what I've memorized. Luomai, lue, luetai, luometha, luestha, luontai. There it is. Third person plural. And so the third person plural, connected with that verb, means they are being loosed. So you get that? That's the passive voice, luontai. They are being loosed. Well, I don't know who's being loosed yet. I'm looking for a nominative in this sentence, and then I notice that right there, hutoi is the demonstrative pronoun. I mastered that one in the last lesson. hutoi, hoi, douloi. These, the slaves, idiomatically, just as these slaves are being loosed. Now here's hupa, commonly used with the passive by genitive to Kyriou, by the Lord. See, that's pretty easy, isn't it? These slaves are being loosed by the Lord. The next exercise, number 2, to logo to Kyriou, agomatha eis tein ecclesian to theou. So again, we're going to have a chance to use our new skills, but notice here I've got the dative, to logo, and my first thought, because I've learned the dative is the indirect object, is I want to say to the word, but I realize that doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when I look at the rest of the sentence, and so I'm suspicious that this is going to be the dative of means. I'll just put that up there, and we'll assume that, and if that's the case, then it's going to be rendered rather by the word. You see, by the word. The word by isn't there, but that's what the dative of means does. It sort of incorporates that notion, which we will translate, even though the word by is not found directly in the sentence. So to logo, by the word, to Kyriou, of the Lord, agomatha, and again I notice that this ending now is going to be the first person plural. So ago, I lead, agomatha, are being led, so we are being led, first person plural. So putting that much together, by the word of the Lord, we are being led, eis tein ecclesian, into the church, to theou, of God. By the word of the Lord, we are being led into the church of God. Third of these that we'll do before shifting to the other set of exercises, uk akuata tes phones tu prophetu, all exerkesthe ek tu oiku autu. So let's just work through it. Uk, I realize, is the negation. It ends with a kappa because it's followed by a vowel with a smooth breather. Uk akuata. Well, look at here. Here's a normal ending, an active ending. So you are hearing. Uk not. You are not hearing. Tes phones. Now, I thought I would have a tein phonane here because we have a verb with what appears to be a direct object. But then I remember, oh yeah, akuo can also take the genitive, and that's what's going on here. So you do not hear tes phones, the voice, to prophetu, of the prophet. Here's a masculine noun of the first declension, but it happens to have the omicron upsilon ending there. You do not hear the voice of the prophet. All, strong conjunction with the abbreviation because it's followed by a verb that starts with a vowel, all ergistha, but this eggs, erkistha, means you go out. Notice the second person plural ending on this deponent verb now, but you go out. Ordinarily, even if you have a compound verb using a preposition, you'll reuse what amounts to the same preposition in the rest of the sentence. So you'll find that quite commonly in the New Testament as well as in the exercises. But you go out, literally out of, to oiku, genitive case, because ek takes the genitive, of him. So putting it all together, you do not hear the voice of the prophet, but you go out of his house. All right, let's jump over to the composition exercises. These exercises take us from English to Greek, usually a little more challenging, but I think you'll find this is fairly straightforward. The first of these reads, these churches are being saved by God from death. So these churches, I recall the demonstrative pronoun, feminine, nominative, plural, hautai, hai, ecclesiae, these the churches, literally, these churches. Now I want the passive meaning, are being saved. The third person plural is ontai, so sodzontai. these churches are being saved. Here is the hupo, which of course is the preposition used commonly with the passive. Hupo takes the genitive, by God. Notice that I'm going to use hupo here, not the dative of means, because in this case we're dealing with God, who is personal. So these churches are being saved by God. Ordinarily, if we're talking about the true God of the Bible, then the definite article will be used. These churches are being saved by God. Apo, from, takes the genitive. To, thanatu, from the word thanatos, means death. Because it's an abstraction, I'm going to use the definite article, which would be idiomatically common in the New Testament, but we translate it simply from death. So these churches are being saved by God from death. The second exercise reads, I am being saved by him and am being taught by his word. So I am being saved. We have the Greek verb sozo, I save. If I'm going to say I am being saved, I want the passive. So sozomai, I am being saved. Hoop, notice that I've contracted it because it starts with the next word starts with a vowel. I am being saved. Hoop, autu, I used hupa because this is personal. I am being saved by him. Kai, and didaskomai, I am being taught. But now notice logo is impersonal, so I'm going to use the dative of means. I am being taught to logo, by the word autu, of him. And that would be typically the way you'd find this in the New Testament. Hupa used with a personal agent, but in the case of to logo, the dative of means, an impersonal agent. And then the last exercise that we're going to do, number 3, we are becoming disciples of the good apostle, but ye are not hearing his voice. All right, ye are becoming, or I should say we are becoming, first person plural. We know the word genomai, the first person plural is ometha, so genometha, we are becoming, it's deponent. So it has this middle or passive ending on a verb of an active meaning. We are becoming. Notice that I've put mathetai in the nominative because, of course, genomai takes the nominative, predicate nominative. We are becoming mathetai, disciples, to agathu, of the good, apostolu, apostle. You could also have said to apostolu, to agathu, the apostle, the good one. Had you put it that way, it would be a little bit more of an emphasis on the goodness of the apostle. Either way is fine. I've done it this way, and so if you did it the other, then that's just fine as well. So we are becoming disciples of the good apostle. Strong conjunction here seems to be implied in the sentence, but I've contracted it because it precedes a word that begins with a vowel. But uk, and I put the kappa there because it precedes a verb that begins with a vowel. But not you hear, or you do not hear. Tes, phones, I've used the genitive, which often takes place with the word akuo. You, but by the way, you could use the accusative. Either one is fine. But you do not hear, tes, phones, the voice of him. And then just to remind you that you could use the accusative as well. I've also given you tain, phonein. Autu, either one would be fine. But that's the sense of it. We are becoming disciples of the good apostle, but you, see, strong conjunction, are not hearing his voice. Well, I hope you found that a helpful explanation, and again, I hope that you'll go ahead and work through all of these exercises. I've provided to the answer key, and so you should make use of that. And again, my strategy in doing this is to do an exercise and immediately check your work. And I think you'll find that that's the most rewarding, or at least helpful as you're going along. Try to make sure that in each case you figured out, if you do make a mistake, exactly what the mistake was. If you need to reread the chapter, you should do so. And hopefully by the time you finish the exercises and the rereading of the chapter, you'll feel quite comfortable with the new ideas that have been introduced in this chapter 10. Main thing here, of course, middle and passive voice, and some of the helping words that we run into in the Greek language that are useful in that connection. So best wishes to you. I'll look forward to seeing you when you come back and join us for chapter 11. Until then, God continue to richly bless your studies of the Greek language. We'll see you next time.